You're 8 months pregnant at 3 a.m. when your husband's phone buzzes. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Wear the red dress. 5 minutes later, the wife won't be a problem much longer. What if your husband wasn't just cheating? What if he'd hired professionals to make you disappear? What if the man you trusted was planning to take your life and your unborn child's? This is Sarah Mitchell's true story of survival against a deadly conspiracy. Hit like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Share this with someone who needs to know they're stronger than they think. What happens next will keep you listening until the very last word. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she stared at her husband's phone screen. The blue location dot pulsing mockingly at the Riverside Motel. 3:15 in the morning. David had kissed her swollen belly just hours ago, whispering about working late on the Henderson case. 8 months pregnant and unable to sleep. She'd reached for his charging phone to check the time. Now the device felt like a bomb in her palm. The front door clicked open. David's footsteps echoed through their Nashville home, measured and careful. Sarah quickly placed the phone back on the nightstand, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hey, sweetheart," David whispered. Sliding into bed beside her, his cologne couldn't quite mask the scent of cheap soap and something else, something floral and unfamiliar. "Sorry I'm so late. Henderson is demanding we review every contract clause." Sarah turned to face him in the darkness. "The Henderson case?" "Yeah, the merger. I told you about it yesterday." His voice carried that patient tone he used when explaining legal concepts to clients. "Your pregnancy brain is really kicking in, isn't it?" The casual dismissal hit like a slap. Sarah had worked in marketing for 7 years before pregnancy fatigue forced her to take leave. Her mind was sharp as ever, just tired. "I remember everything you tell me, David." He reached over and rubbed her shoulder. "Of course you do. I'm just saying pregnancy affects memory sometimes. It's completely normal. The baby's taking everything he needs from you." Sarah bit her tongue. They'd agreed not to learn the baby's gender. But David had started using masculine pronouns weeks ago. Another small crack in their foundation she had chosen to ignore. "Maybe you should talk to Dr. Morrison about it at your next appointment," David continued. "She might recommend some supplements to help with the brain fog." Brain fog, as if her growing suspicions were just hormonal confusion. "I'm fine, David. I know you are." He kissed her forehead. "You're going to be such an amazing mother. Get some sleep." Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Sarah lay awake until dawn, feeling their baby shift restlessly inside her, as if sensing her turmoil. The next morning, David left early for court. Sarah waited until his BMW disappeared around the corner before driving to Riverside Motel. The desk clerk, a tired woman with kind eyes, confirmed what Sarah already knew. "Room 12, yeah, regular customer. Nice young man. Always pays cash. Usually has his girlfriend with him. Pretty blonde thing." Sarah's world tilted sideways. "How long has he been coming here?" "Oh, about 6 months now. Always Friday nights, sometimes weekends." 6 months, right around the time Sarah started showing, when her pregnancy became visible to the world. That afternoon, Sarah sat in their living room, staring at the ultrasound photo on the coffee table. Their baby, due in 4 weeks, completely dependent on her protection. She'd built her entire life around David, trusted him with their future. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "Working late again tonight. Henderson needs final revisions. Love you both." As Sarah screenshotted the message and then called the law firm. "Mitchell, Carter and Associates." The receptionist answered. "Hi, this is Sarah Mitchell. Is my husband David available?" "Oh, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry, but Mr. Mitchell left about an hour ago. He said he had a family emergency." The lies were unraveling faster than Sarah could process them. She thanked the receptionist and hung up, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the phone. At 7 o'clock, she drove back to the Riverside Motel. David's BMW sat in the parking lot beside a red Honda Civic she didn't recognize. Room 12's curtains were drawn tight. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, watching the motel room door, feeling their baby kick frantically as her stress spiked. She couldn't bring herself to knock, couldn't face whatever truth waited behind that door. When David came home at midnight, Sarah pretended to be asleep. He showered longer than usual, humming softly. The sound made her stomach turn. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would confront him with evidence he couldn't explain away. Tonight, she would hold on to the last few hours of believing her marriage might survive this betrayal. As David settled beside her, Sarah placed her hand on her belly and made a silent promise to their unborn child. Whatever happened next, she would protect them both. No matter what it cost her, Sarah found the earring wedged between the passenger seat and console of David's BMW. A delicate silver drop with a tiny diamond. Nothing she'd ever owned. Her own jewelry ran towards simple gold pieces, practical and classic. This earring screamed expensive but in younger money. She'd borrowed David's car that morning after her sedan wouldn't start. Another small failure in what felt like a cascading collapse. The earring had caught the morning light just right, winking at her like a cruel joke. Now she sat in the parking lot of Mitchell, Carter and Associates, the earring burning in her palm. Through the law firm's glass windows, she could see David bent over documents, his dark hair falling across his forehead the way it had when they first met. 7 years of marriage, and she thought she knew every expression on his face. The receptionist smiled when Sarah entered. "Mrs. Mitchell, how are you feeling? You look ready to pop." Sarah forced a smile. "Getting close. Is Ashley Connor available? I need to ask her something about David's schedule." "Of course, down the hall. Third door on the right." Ashley Connor's office was twice the size of the other paralegals, with a view of downtown Nashville's skyline. The woman behind the desk looked up from her computer, and Sarah's heart sank. Blonde hair in perfect waves, emerald eyes, probably 25 at most, beautiful in that effortless way that came with youth and money. "Mrs. Mitchell." Ashley stood, smoothing her pencil skirt. "What a nice surprise. How can I help you?" Sarah studied Ashley's ears. Empty. No jewelry at all except a tennis bracelet that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary when she was working. "I found this in David's car." Sarah held up the earring. "I thought one of his colleagues might have dropped it." Ashley's composure never cracked, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Oh my, I have no idea whose that could be. Maybe from a client meeting. Maybe." Sarah waited, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "It's beautiful. Expensive looking. I wouldn't know. I'm not much of a jewelry person." Ashley touched her bare earlobe unconsciously. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" "Actually, yes. David's been working such long hours lately. The Henderson case, right?" "Henderson case." Ashley's brow furrowed. "I'm not familiar with that one. David's been focused on the Patterson merger mostly." Another lie crumbling. Sarah felt dizzy, whether from pregnancy or shock. She couldn't tell. "Maybe I'm confused," Sarah said carefully. "Pregnancy brain. You know how it is." "Oh, absolutely. My sister went through the same thing. She couldn't remember her own address some days." Ashley's laugh sounded forced. "You should really consider getting some help, Miss Mitchell, professional help. Pregnancy can be so overwhelming, especially for first-time mothers." The suggestion felt like a warning wrapped in false concern. Sarah stood slowly, her back aching from the weight of the baby. "Thank you for the advice. I'll be sure to mention our conversation to David." "Of course, give him my best." Sarah walked to David's office, the earring still clutched in her fist. Through his open door, she could see him reviewing contracts, looking every inch the successful attorney, her husband, the father of her unborn child, the man who'd been lying to her for months. "Sarah," David looked up, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She sat heavily in the chair across from his desk. "Your car wouldn't start this morning, so I drove mine. Found something interesting." She placed the earring on his desk blotter. David barely glanced at it. "Must be from a client. You know how many people we have in and out of here." Ashley said she wasn't familiar with the Henderson case. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ashley's not involved in every case we handle. She's junior level. With the corner office and the view." "Sarah, what exactly are you implying here?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking direct questions and getting confusing answers." David leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same analytical gaze he used on opposing counsel. "Honey, I think the stress of pregnancy is affecting your judgment. You're seeing conspiracies where there aren't any." "My judgment is fine, David." "Is it because showing up at my office with wild accusations based on a random earring Seems pretty irrational. The word irrational hit like a physical blow. Sarah had heard it before, usually right before David explained why her concerns were unfounded. Her worries overblown, her instincts wrong. Maybe you should talk to someone, David continued, a therapist who specializes in prenatal anxiety. I can get you some referrals. Sarah stood, her body protesting the sudden movement. Keep the earring. I'm sure you'll figure out who it belongs to. She walked out of his office with as much dignity as an 8-month pregnant woman could muster, feeling David's eyes on her back. In the elevator, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. I love you. Please don't let pregnancy hormones poison your mind against me. Think about our baby. Sarah deleted the message without responding. Outside, Nashville's summer heat felt suffocating. She sat in her car with the air conditioning running, one hand on her belly, feeling their child move restlessly inside her. The baby deserved better than this uncertainty, these lies, this growing fear that the man she'd married was a stranger. Sarah pulled out of the parking lot, a plan forming in her mind, time to stop asking questions and start finding answers. Sarah stared at the computer screen in disbelief, refreshing their bank account page for the third time. The numbers didn't change. Checking account $842, savings account 0, money market account 0. 2 days ago, their accounts had held nearly $50,000. Their baby's future, their emergency fund, years of careful saving, gone. Her hands shook as she called the bank's customer service line, navigating through automated menus while her baby kicked anxiously inside her. First National Bank, this is Jennifer. How can I help you? This is Sarah Mitchell. I need to understand some transactions on my accounts. Large withdrawals I didn't authorize. I'll be happy to help. Can you verify your social security number and account information? Sarah provided the details, each digit feeling like a nail in her coffin. I see the transfers you're asking about. They were authorized electronically by David Mitchell on Tuesday, using your joint account access codes. I didn't authorize any transfers. I understand your concern, Mrs. Mitchell, but legally, both account holders can access these funds independently. The transfers went to an investment account at Prosperity Financial, also under both your names. Sarah felt the room spinning. What investment account? According to our records, it was opened 6 months ago. Both signatures are on file. 6 months ago, when David started spending Friday nights at the Riverside Motel, after hanging up, Sarah called Prosperity Financial. The investment account existed, but the funds had been transferred again yesterday to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The representative couldn't provide details about the recipient without both account holders present. Sarah slumped back in her desk chair, feeling her baby shift uncomfortably. How had David forged her signature? When had he gained access to her online banking codes? The front door opened. David's voice carried from the entryway, talking on his phone. Yes, Mother, everything's proceeding as planned. The accounts are secured. Sarah's blood ran cold. David's mother, Ruth Mitchell, had never approved of their marriage. Old Nashville money. Ruth had made it clear she thought David was settling beneath his station. Sarah crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear. The pregnancy has made her increasingly unstable. David continued. Dr. Morrison agrees that intervention might be necessary soon, for the baby's safety. Dr. Morrison, Sarah's own obstetrician, the woman she trusted with her and her baby's health. I know, Mother. It's unfortunate, but Sarah's behavior has become concerning. The accusations, the paranoia. She's not fit to raise a child in this condition. Sarah gripped the banister, fighting waves of nausea. They were talking about her like she was mentally ill, dangerous to her own baby. The legal documentation is already in place. David's voice grew closer. If she requires hospitalization, the custody arrangements will be straightforward. Custody arrangements for her unborn child. Sarah retreated to their bedroom, closing the door as quietly as possible. Her mind raced through the implications. David wasn't just having an affair. He was systematically destroying her life, making her appear unstable while positioning himself as the responsible parent. But why? What did he gain by removing her from the picture? The answer hit her like a physical blow. Insurance. David had increased her life insurance policy to $2 million just 3 months ago, claiming it was responsible planning for new parents. She'd signed the papers without reading them carefully, trusting her husband to handle their financial planning. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed her best friend, Maria Santos. "Sarah, thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you for hours." "Maria, listen to me carefully. Don't say anything over the phone that you wouldn't want recorded. Can you meet me at Centennial Park in 30 minutes? How did you tell? Just trust me. Park near the Parthenon. South side, come alone." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, wondering if paranoia was actually just delayed recognition of reality. 30 minutes later, she found Maria pacing beside the Parthenon replica, her usually perfect appearance disheveled. Maria had been Sarah's roommate in college, her maid of honor, the friend who knew all her secrets. "Maria, what's going on?" Maria glanced around nervously before pulling Sarah behind a cluster of trees. "I got a call today from an attorney asking about your mental state. Apparently, David's building a case for emergency custody and involuntary psychiatric commitment." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. "What attorney?" "Someone from Blackwood and Associates. They're specialists in high-conflict custody cases." Maria gripped Sarah's shoulders. Sarah, they asked if I'd ever witnessed erratic behavior, substance abuse, threats of self-harm. I've never done any of those things." "I know, but they're creating a paper trail." The attorney mentioned medical records showing concerning psychological symptoms and risk factors for postpartum psychosis. Sarah felt her baby kick frantically, responding to her elevated heart rate. "My medical records are confidential. Not from your husband, and not if there's an emergency custody situation involving fetal endangerment." "Fetal endangerment." Sarah's voice cracked. "I would never hurt my baby. I know that. But Sarah, you need to understand what's happening here. This isn't just about an affair. David is systematically building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent. Once the baby is born, he'll have sole custody. If something happens to you afterward..." Maria didn't need to finish the sentence. $2 million in life insurance would set David up nicely with his young mistress. "What do I do?" "We fight back. I'm a divorce attorney. Remember? We file for emergency protection, freeze the remaining assets, get you independent medical evaluation." Maria's voice strengthened with purpose. "But Sarah, you need to document everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every strange conversation. And you need to stay safe." As they walked back toward the parking lot, Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. She wasn't alone. She had an ally who understood the legal system. But deep down, a voice whispered that Maria's help might be too little, too late. David had been planning this for months, possibly longer. And Sarah was just beginning to understand how deep his betrayal ran. Dr. Morrison's office felt different this time. Sarah sat on the examination table, paper crinkling beneath her, watching her trusted physician review charts with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, clinical, almost hostile. "Your blood pressure is elevated again." "Sarah, that's concerning at this stage of pregnancy. I've been under stress lately." Dr. Morrison looked up sharply. "What kind of stress?" Sarah hesitated. After yesterday's conversation with Maria, she'd decided to be more careful about what she revealed. "Normal pregnancy worries. Financial planning, getting the nursery ready." "I see." Dr. Morrison made a note. "And how has your mood been? Any anxiety, depression, unusual thoughts?" "Unusual thoughts. Paranoid ideation. Suspicions about people close to you, feeling like others are plotting against you." Sarah's heart started racing. These weren't routine prenatal questions. "Why are you asking about that?" Dr. Morrison set down her pen and studied Sarah with unsettling intensity. "Because your husband called yesterday with some concerning observations about your behavior." The betrayal hit like a physical blow. David had poisoned her relationship with her own doctor. "What did he tell you?" "That you've been making accusations about his fidelity, showing up at his workplace with bizarre theories, becoming increasingly paranoid and irrational." Dr. Morrison's voice carried the patient tone reserved for difficult patients. "He's worried about your mental state and how it might affect the baby." What Sarah forced herself to speak calmly. Did he mention that I found evidence of his affair? Sarah, what you believe is evidence and what actually constitutes proof are often different things when someone is experiencing prenatal psychological distress. Prenatal psychological distress. Dr. Morrison pulled out a thick file. I've been reviewing your records. The blood work we've been doing monthly shows some concerning markers. Sarah's confusion deepened. What markers? Trace amounts of substances that shouldn't be present in a pregnant woman's system. Initially, I thought it might be contamination or processing error, but the levels have been consistent for 3 months. What substances? Primarily lithium and risperidone. Both are psychiatric medications that can be dangerous during pregnancy. Sarah felt the room tilting. I'm not taking any psychiatric medications. That's what's concerning. Either you're taking them without medical supervision, which is extremely dangerous for your baby, or, Dr. Morrison paused meaningfully, or what? Or you're not aware you're taking them, which suggests significant memory issues that require immediate psychiatric evaluation. Sarah's mind raced. The prenatal vitamins David brought her every morning, the special protein shakes he insisted she drink, the herbal teas he prepared personally, claiming they helped with pregnancy nausea. I want copies of all my blood work results. Dr. Morrison shook her head. Given your current state, I think it's best if we involve your husband in all medical decisions going forward. He's expressed willingness to help monitor your medication, compliance, and mental status. You can't do that without my consent. Actually, in cases where maternal mental illness poses a risk to fetal development, Tennessee law allows for emergency intervention. Your husband is exploring legal guardianship options to ensure proper medical care. Sarah stood abruptly, her head spinning. I'm leaving. Sarah, please sit down. We need to discuss hospitalization options for your safety and the baby's. Hospitalization. Voluntary admission for psychiatric evaluation, just until we can stabilize your medications and ensure you're ready for motherhood. Sarah backed toward the door. I'm not voluntarily admitting myself anywhere. Dr. Morrison pressed a button on her desk. Then we may need to consider involuntary commitment under the state's emergency psychiatric hold provisions. The door opened. 2 security guards entered, their presence transforming the medical office into a trap. Mrs. Mitchell, one guard said gently, please have a seat. Dr. Morrison just wants to help you. Sarah looked around frantically. The window was too high. The guards blocked the door. Her baby kicked frantically, sensing her panic. Please, she whispered. I'm not mentally ill. My husband is poisoning me. Dr. Morrison's expression softened with false sympathy. That's exactly the kind of paranoid delusion we need to address. Sarah, for your baby's sake. Sarah forced herself to calm down, thinking of Maria's advice about documentation. I want to call my attorney. Of course, but first, let's get you comfortable and safe. One guard moved closer. Sarah knew if they sedated her, she'd wake up committed to a psychiatric facility with no legal rights and no way to protect her baby. Wait, she said, pulling out her phone. Just let me call my friend Maria. She's a lawyer. She can explain the legal requirements for involuntary commitment. Dr. Morrison hesitated. 5 minutes. But Sarah, this is for your own good. Sarah dialed Maria's number with shaking fingers, praying her friend would answer and somehow understand the coded message she was about to send. Maria Santos. Maria, it's Sarah. I'm at Dr. Morrison's office. She says I need psychiatric hospitalization because David told her I'm taking lithium and risperidone. A long pause. Sarah, stay exactly where you are. Don't agree to anything. Don't sign anything. I'm calling Judge Harrison for an emergency restraining order. They want to commit me involuntarily. That requires a court hearing with evidence from 2 independent physicians. Dr. Morrison can't do it alone. Tell her you're invoking your right to independent medical evaluation. Sarah looked at Dr. Morrison. I'm invoking my right to independent medical evaluation before any psychiatric commitment proceedings. Dr. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. That's not necessary in emergency situations. Yes, it is. Maria's voice carried through the phone speaker. Tennessee statute requires it. Sarah, I'm filing papers now. Don't let them take you anywhere. The security guards looked uncertain. Dr. Morrison stepped aside to make a phone call, her voice too low to hear. Sarah stayed on the line with Maria. feeling her baby's movements slow as her own heart rate decreased. Maybe she could fight this. Maybe the legal system would protect her. But as Dr. Morrison returned with a grim expression, Sarah realized she was only delaying the inevitable. The trap was closing, and she was running out of allies she could trust. Sarah's car felt different that morning. The brake pedal seemed softer than usual, requiring more pressure to slow down. She attributed it to pregnancy paranoia until she reached the steep hill leading down from her neighborhood toward downtown Nashville. The traffic light at the bottom turned red. Sarah pressed the brake pedal. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. The pedal went to the floor with sickening ease. Her sedan continued accelerating down the hill, gathering speed as gravity took control. Panic flooded her system. Sarah yanked the steering wheel right, aiming for the grassy median instead of the busy intersection ahead. The car bounced violently as it hit the curb, throwing her forward against the seatbelt. The airbag deployed with explosive force, filling the cabin with white powder and chemical smoke. Sarah's world went dark. She woke to sirens and voices, her head pounding and her vision blurry. Paramedics surrounded her car, their hands already checking her vitals through the shattered driver's side window. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Don't try to move. We're going to get you out of there." "My baby," Sarah whispered, her hands instinctively moving to her belly. "Is my baby okay? We're going to check everything at the hospital. Just stay still." The extraction process felt endless. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as firefighters cut away parts of the car door. Through the chaos, she heard one paramedic talking to another. "Brake lines are completely severed. Clean cuts. Both of them. Accident. Doesn't look like it." Sarah tried to speak, to tell them about David, about the systematic destruction of her life. But darkness claimed her again. She woke in a hospital bed, electrodes attached to her chest and a fetal monitor strapped around her swollen belly. The rhythmic sound of her baby's heartbeat filled the room like a lifeline. "Sarah," David's voice came from beside her bed. He looked perfectly composed, concerned but not panicked. "Thank God you're awake. The doctors were worried." "The brakes," Sarah said weakly. "Someone cut my brake lines." David squeezed her hand. "Honey, you're confused. The paramedics said it was brake failure. These things happen with older cars." "No, I heard them. They said the cuts were clean." "You have a concussion. Sometimes trauma causes people to hear things that weren't actually said." David's voice carried that patient, explaining tone again. "Dr. Morrison thinks the stress you've been under might have contributed to this accident." Sarah tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her back down. "Dr. Morrison is here." "She's your obstetrician." "Of course she's here." David smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Sarah, she's concerned about the baby. The trauma from the crash has caused some complications." Fear cut through the fog in Sarah's head. "What complications?" Dr. Morrison entered the room as if summoned. "Sarah, I'm glad you're conscious. We need to discuss your condition. Is my baby okay?" "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but the trauma has triggered some concerning changes. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, and we're seeing signs of placental stress." Sarah looked at the monitors. The numbers meant nothing to her, but Dr. Morrison's expression was grave. "We may need to consider early delivery if the situation doesn't stabilize." "How early?" "You're at 36 weeks. The baby would likely survive, but there are risks." David leaned forward. "What's best for both of them?" "Doctor, ideally we'd like to get Sarah to full term, but given her recent mental health concerns and now this trauma, we may need to prioritize fetal safety." Sarah felt trapped between their clinical discussion of her body and her baby as if she wasn't present to make her own decisions. "I want a second opinion," she said firmly. Dr. Morrison exchanged a look with David. "Sarah, in your current state, with a head injury and elevated stress hormones, it might be better to focus on following medical advice rather than seeking multiple opinions." "It's my body, my baby." "Actually," David said quietly, "given the psychiatric evaluation Dr. Morrison recommended earlier, and now this accident that could have been prevented if you'd been thinking clearly." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. They were building a case that she was mentally unfit to make decisions about her own medical care. Sarah's phone buzzed on the bedside table. David reached for it, but Sarah grabbed it first. A text from Maria. "Judge granted temporary restraining order. You have legal protection. Don't sign anything. Who's texting you? David asked. Maria. Sarah, I don't think Maria is the best influencer right now. She's encouraging your paranoid thinking. Dr. Morrison stepped closer. Mrs. Mitchell, has anyone explained the legal implications if you continue to refuse treatment recommendations? What legal implications? If medical professionals determine that maternal mental illness or poor judgment poses a risk to fetal welfare, the state can intervene to protect the unborn child. Sarah stared at them both, understanding finally crystallizing. The car accident wasn't random. It was the next step in David's plan. Now she was injured, vulnerable, and they could claim the crash proved she was unsafe. I want to call my lawyer. Of course, David said smoothly. But first, let's focus on stabilizing your condition. Maria can visit once the doctors clear you for stress. A nurse entered with a syringe. Time for your medication. Mrs. Mitchell, what medication? Something to help with your anxiety and stabilize your blood pressure. Dr. Morrison explained. It's safe for the baby. Sarah looked at the syringe, remembering the psychiatric medications that had mysteriously appeared in her blood work. I don't consent to any medications. Sarah, you're being irrational, David said. This is exactly what Dr. Morrison was worried about. The nurse approached with the syringe. Sarah realized that in this hospital room, surrounded by people who claimed to be helping her, she was more trapped than she'd ever been. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Maria. Federal investigators want to talk to you. Don't take any medications. Federal investigators. Sarah's heart rate monitor started beeping faster. Give me my phone, she told David. You need to rest. Give me my phone or I'll scream until security comes. David reluctantly handed her the device. Sarah speed-dialed Maria's number, praying her friend would answer quickly. But before the call could connect, the nurse had injected something into her IV line. For your own good, Dr. Morrison said as Sarah's vision started to blur. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was David's satisfied smile. Sarah woke to the sound of hushed voices in the hospital corridor. Her head felt thick, cotton-filled, and her mouth tasted like metal. The medication they'd given her had left her groggy and disoriented, but she forced herself to focus on the conversation drifting through her partially open door. Found him this morning in his apartment, someone was saying. Apparent suicide. Left a note confessing to harassment and stalking. Terrible tragedy, David's voice responded. Sarah will be devastated. Jake was her ex-boyfriend from college. She'd been in contact with him recently. Sarah's blood ran cold. Jake Sullivan, the private investigator Maria had recommended, the man who'd agreed to help document David's affair and financial manipulations. The note mentioned guilt over enabling delusional behavior. The first voice continued. Apparently, he'd been feeding into paranoid fantasies about her husband. Mental illness can be contagious in a way, David said with perfectly calibrated sadness. When someone unstable finds another person willing to validate their delusions, it can escalate quickly. Sarah bit her tongue to keep from crying out. Jake was dead. The one person who'd been gathering evidence of David's crimes, gone. And somehow, David was spinning his death as proof of Sarah's mental instability. The voices moved away down the corridor. Right, Sarah lay still, processing the implications. Jake had been careful, professional. He'd worked cases involving dangerous people for years. He wouldn't have killed himself. Her phone sat on the bedside table, just out of reach. Sarah stretched painfully, her body still sore from the crash, and managed to grab it. Several missed calls from Maria, and one voicemail. She listened with the volume barely audible. Sarah, don't trust anyone at that hospital. Jake found something big before he died. He sent me files right before it happened. We need to meet as soon as you're released. Be careful who you talk to. Sarah deleted the voicemail and texted back, can't talk, being monitored. We'll call when safe. The door opened. Dr. Morrison entered with a clipboard and that same cold expression she'd worn during yesterday's examination. How are you feeling, Sarah? Groggy. What did you give me? Mild sedatives to prevent seizures and reduce stress on the baby. Dr. Morrison checked the monitors. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share. Sarah waited, knowing what was coming. Jake Sullivan passed away last night. Suicide. Your husband mentioned you'd been in contact with him recently. Jake wouldn't kill himself. Dr. Morrison made a note. Suicide is often unexpected, especially when someone has been struggling with mental health issues. What mental health issues? According to the police report, he left a detailed confession about participating in surveillance activities that he knew were based on delusional thinking. The guilt became overwhelming. Sarah closed her eyes. Even in death, Jake was being used against her. The note mentioned that he'd been documenting your husband's daily activities based on your suspicions about infidelity. When he realized he was enabling paranoid behavior that could harm your marriage and your baby's future, he couldn't live with himself. It was just a perfect narrative. Jake's investigation reframed as stalking, his professional surveillance work twisted into harassment, his death positioned as proof that Sarah's delusions had real consequences. I want to see the note. That's police evidence, but Sarah, this tragedy illustrates why we're so concerned about your mental state. Your paranoid thinking has now contributed to someone's death. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Sarah opened her eyes and stared at Dr. Morrison. You think I'm responsible for Jake's death? I think untreated mental illness creates tragic situations. Jake Sullivan was a vulnerable person who got caught up in your fantasy about your husband having an affair. It's not a fantasy. Dr. Morrison sat down beside the bed. Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. The police investigation into your car accident has concluded it was driver error, likely caused by confusion and poor judgment related to your mental state. Your friend Jake's suicide note confirms that you've been experiencing persistent paranoid delusions about your husband. The psychiatric medications in your blood work indicate you're either taking unprescribed drugs or experiencing such severe memory issues that you don't remember taking them. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Every piece of evidence that could have supported her story was being systematically destroyed or reinterpreted. Now, Dr. Morrison continued, we can help you. Voluntary admission to psychiatric care, proper medication management, therapy to address these delusions before they cause more harm. Well, then if I refuse, given that your mental illness has now contributed to someone's death, and considering the danger to your unborn child, the court will likely order involuntary commitment and emergency custody transfer. Sarah understood. This was the end game. Jake's death had provided the final piece of evidence they needed to paint her as dangerously mentally ill. I need to call Maria. Mrs. Santos is being investigated for her role in Jake Sullivan's surveillance activities. She may face charges for conspiracy and harassment. Sarah's last ally, neutralized. You're lying. Dr. Morrison stood. I understand this is difficult to accept. Mental illness often involves the inability to recognize one's own condition. But Sarah, your baby deserves a chance at a healthy life. After Dr. Morrison left, Sarah lay in the hospital bed feeling utterly alone. David's plan had been meticulous. Every person who tried to help her had been eliminated or discredited. Every piece of evidence had been explained away. But Maria's voicemail had mentioned files Jake sent before his death. Information that might still exist somewhere. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think like the marketing professional she'd been before pregnancy sidelined her career. David was smart, but he was also arrogant. Criminals always made mistakes when they thought they'd won. The question was whether she could find his mistake before he permanently removed her from the picture. Outside her hospital room, she heard David's voice again, speaking to someone on the phone. Yes, the arrangements are proceeding smoothly. Once the psychiatric commitment is finalized, the custody transfer will be automatic. The insurance policy activations can proceed as planned. Sarah's baby kicked frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger they both faced. Time was running out. The women's shelter felt like sanctuary. Maria had found it after Sarah's discharge from the hospital, a safe house run by domestic violence advocates who understood the complex ways abusers manipulated the system. For the first time in weeks, Sarah could breathe freely. The legal documentation is solid, Maria assured her as they sat in the shelter's common room. Emergency protective order, temporary custody protections, independent psychiatric evaluation scheduled for tomorrow. Sarah cradled her enormous belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly. 37 weeks now. Full term was approaching, and with it, the most vulnerable time for both of them. Jake's files arrived by courier this morning, Maria continued, pulling out a thick envelope. He was thorough. Financial records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations. David's entire operation is documented here. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Photographs of David and Ashley at the motel, bank transfer records, even copies of forged documents with her signature. How did Jake get all this? He was good at his job, and he knew something was seriously wrong. Maria's voice softened. Sarah, there's something else. Jake suspected he was being watched toward the end. He set up dead man switches, automated systems to release information if something happened to him. Dead man switches. Email servers that send pre-written messages if he doesn't check in regularly. Files uploaded to cloud storage with delayed release dates. He was protecting you even after death. Sarah felt tears starting. Jake had died trying to save her and her baby. The most important thing is this. Maria pulled out a recording device. Jake managed to record a conversation between David and Ashley discussing timeline for your accident and how to handle custody afterward. They recorded themselves planning my murder. Essentially, yes. It's enough to put them both in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah stared at the device, hardly believing they had proof. Real, solid evidence that could destroy David's careful narrative about her mental illness. There's more, Maria said. Jake traced the psychiatric medications in your blood to a pharmacy in Ashley's name. David was having the drugs compounded into your prenatal vitamins. He was literally poisoning me. Slowly, carefully, creating the symptoms of mental illness while positioning himself as the concerned husband. Maria's anger was evident. It's psychological torture. Sarah, but now we can prove it. A shelter volunteer approached their table. Sarah, you have a visitor. Says she's your mother-in-law. Sarah and Maria exchanged glances. Ruth Mitchell had never visited Sarah anywhere, had barely acknowledged her existence since the wedding. Should I tell her you're not available? The volunteer asked. No, Sarah decided. I want to hear what she has to say. Ruth Mitchell entered the common room like a queen surveying peasants. Expensive clothes, perfect makeup, the kind of controlled elegance that came with generational wealth. She looked around the shelter with barely concealed disgust. Sarah, dear, you look terrible. What do you want? Ruth. Ruth sat down across from them, smoothing her skirt. I want to help you. Of course, this whole situation has gotten out of hand. What situation? Your mental breakdown. David is beside himself with worry. Ruth's voice carried false concern. But I found an excellent private facility in Switzerland. Very discreet, very effective treatment for women experiencing pregnancy-related psychosis. I'm not having a psychotic break. Ruth laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Of course you think that, dear. That's the nature of mental illness. But look at yourself. Hiding in a shelter, making wild accusations about my son, surrounding yourself with people who encourage your delusions. She gestured toward Maria. This woman, for instance, filling your head with legal nonsense when what you really need is medical treatment. Maria leaned forward. Mrs. Mitchell, your son is being investigated for financial fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Investigated by whom? A dead private investigator and a lawyer who's about to lose her license for professional misconduct. Sarah felt the temperature in the room drop. What are you talking about? Ruth smiled coldly. Maria Santos is facing ethics charges for client abandonment, conflict of interest, and conspiracy to commit harassment. The Tennessee Bar Association received a comprehensive complaint yesterday. Maria's face went white. That's impossible. I haven't abandoned any clients or violated any ethical guidelines. Haven't you taken on a case involving your emotionally unstable best friend, encouraging paranoid delusions, working with a private investigator to stalk my son? Ruth's voice sharpened. The complaint includes detailed evidence of professional misconduct spanning several months. Sarah looked at Maria, seeing her friend's confidence crumble. Maria, I don't understand. Everything I've done has been legitimate legal representation. Ruth pulled out her phone and showed them a document. Emergency suspension of law license pending investigation. Effective immediately, Maria Santos is no longer authorized to practice law in Tennessee. The shelter common room seemed to spin around Sarah. Her legal protection had just evaporated. Of course, Ruth continued conversationally. The Bar Association acted quickly because they received corroborating testimony from several concerned parties. What parties? Maria whispered. Dr. Morrison, for one, she documented Mrs. Santos's interference with medical treatment and encouragement of paranoid thinking. The law firm where my son works provided evidence of stalking and harassment. Ruth stood, brushing imaginary dust from her clothes. Even poor Jake Sullivan left testimony before his tragic death, expressing concern about being manipulated into illegal surveillance activities. Sarah felt her baby kick frantically, responding to her spiking stress. You orchestrated all of this. I protected my son from a woman having a psychiatric emergency who was destroying his career and reputation. Ruth's mask finally slipped, revealing cold calculation underneath. Sarah, you're going to that Swiss facility. You're going to sign custody papers, and you're going to disappear quietly, for everyone's sake. And if I refuse, Ruth's smile returned, predatory and sharp, then tomorrow's psychiatric evaluation will recommend immediate involuntary commitment. The baby will be delivered by emergency cesarean for its own safety. David will have sole custody, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a psychiatric institution, heavily medicated and completely discredited. Sarah looked around the shelter, realizing it wasn't sanctuary at all. It was another trap, carefully baited with a false hope. Maria, she whispered, tell me you didn't. Maria's silence was answer enough. Sarah saw it in her friend's eyes, the terrible truth that completed David's perfect plan. Maria had been working with them all along. The betrayal hit Sarah like physical pain. Maria, her best friend since college, her maid of honor, the woman she trusted with her deepest fears, sitting across from her now with guilt and shame written across her face. How long? Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. Maria couldn't meet her eyes. Since the beginning. Since before you got pregnant. Ruth Mitchell looked satisfied, like a cat watching cornered prey. Maria approached us when David first mentioned marriage. She was concerned about his future, about the kind of woman he was choosing. You approached them. Sarah, you have to understand, David is brilliant, successful, from an important family. You were, Maria struggled for words. You were always so intense, so emotional. I thought he was making a mistake. Sarah felt her baby moving frantically inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate and stress hormones. So, you agreed to spy on me. Not spy, just monitor the situation. Make sure David knew what he was getting into. Ruth leaned back in her chair, enjoying the revelation. Maria has been providing valuable insights into your psychological state for quite some time. The increasing paranoia, the tendency toward dramatic thinking, the way you interpret normal situations as conspiracies. I was right about everything. Were you? Maria's voice carried defensive anger now. Sarah, you've always been this way. In college, you were convinced our sorority sisters were plotting against you. You thought professors were grading you unfairly because of personal bias. You've always seen malice where there wasn't any. The words cut deep because they contained just enough truth to sound plausible. Sarah had always been intuitive, had always picked up on subtle social dynamics that others missed. But Maria was reframing that sensitivity as paranoia. The Jake Sullivan situation, Ruth continued, was particularly concerning. Maria suggested we might need professional help to document your declining mental state. You set up Jake's death. Jake Sullivan killed himself, Maria said firmly. But yes, we guided the investigation to ensure the proper narrative was established. Sarah stared at her former best friend, seeing a stranger. You helped them murder him. He was encouraging your delusions. He was supposed to investigate and then report back that David wasn't having an affair. Instead, he started creating evidence to support your paranoid theories. Because they were true. Ruth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Nashville skyline. Truth is relative. Dear, what matters is what's best for everyone involved. The baby, Sarah said suddenly. You want my baby. David wants his child, naturally, but you're not fit to be a mother. Sarah, you never were. Maria leaned forward, her voice taking on a pleading tone. Sarah, the Swiss facility is beautiful, private, comfortable. You'd have the best care, time to heal from whatever's been affecting your thinking. While David raises my child with his mistress, while your child grows up in a stable, healthy environment, Ruth corrected, with parents who can provide proper guidance and opportunities. Sarah felt a contraction begin, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. The stress was triggering early labor. "I need to get to a hospital," she gasped. "You are getting medical care," Ruth said calmly. "Dr. Morrison is waiting in the van outside." Sarah realized the shelter room had no other exits. The volunteer who'd announced Ruth's arrival was blocking the doorway, no longer looking helpful. "The contractions are starting early," Maria observed. "That's perfect timing." "Perfect timing for what?" Ruth returned to her seat. "For emergency delivery under psychiatric emergency protocols. Once the baby is safely delivered, you'll be transferred directly to secure psychiatric care. The Swiss facility. Actually, something closer. A private institution here in Tennessee where David can visit regularly." Ruth's smile was razor sharp. "You'll be heavily medicated, of course, for your own safety." Sarah felt another contraction. Stronger this time, her body was betraying her at the worst possible moment. "The beauty of psychiatric institutions," Ruth continued conversationally, "is that patients often become confused about their own histories. Memory becomes unreliable. After a few months of proper medication, you might not even remember having these paranoid thoughts about David." "Chemical lobotomy," Sarah whispered. "Treatment," Maria corrected. "Sarah, deep down you must know something is wrong with your thinking. Normal wives don't suspect their husbands of elaborate murder plots." Sarah looked around the room, feeling trapped and increasingly desperate. The contractions were coming every few minutes now. Soon she'd be too incapacitated to fight back. "Where's David?" she asked. "Preparing for fatherhood," Ruth said. "He's quite excited about becoming a single parent. And Ashley will make an excellent stepmother once you're out of the picture." Another contraction gripped Sarah, this one strong enough to make her cry out. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. "I won't sign custody papers," she managed between waves of pain. "You won't need to," Maria said sadly. "Psychiatric patients aren't legally competent to make parental decisions." Ruth checked her watch. "Dr. Morrison should be ready for us now." The volunteer opened the door. Sarah could see medical personnel in the hallway, a wheelchair waiting, the trap finally springing shut. But as they helped her into the wheelchair, Sarah felt something besides panic and pain: determination. Maternal instinct stronger than fear. David had been planning this for months, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated what a mother would do to protect her child. As they wheeled her toward the van, Sarah began planning her own endgame. The van's interior looked exactly like a medical transport vehicle, complete with monitors, oxygen tanks, and restraint systems. Dr. Morrison sat beside Sarah as they drove through Nashville, checking her vitals with the same cold efficiency she'd shown in the hospital. "Contractions every 4 minutes," Dr. Morrison announced to someone up front. "We should have about an hour before active labor begins." "Perfect timing," Ruth's voice carried from the passenger seat. "The facility is expecting us." Sarah gritted her teeth through another contraction, using the pain to keep her mind sharp. Something felt wrong about this whole scenario, something beyond the obvious betrayal and medical kidnapping. Dr. Morrison seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone and glancing toward the front of the van. Maria sat across from them, no longer meeting Sarah's eyes, her hands shaking despite her calm words earlier. "Dr. Morrison," Sarah said during a break between contractions, "how long have you been working with David?" "I've been providing medical consultation regarding your condition for several months." "My condition?" "Pregnancy-induced psychiatric symptoms requiring intervention." Sarah studied the doctor's face. "When did you first meet Ashley Connor?" Dr. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know what you mean." "Ashley Connor, David's mistress. The woman who's going to help raise my baby." "I'm not familiar with anyone by that name." But Dr. Morrison's nervous glance toward the front of the van told a different story. Sarah followed her gaze and saw something that made her heart stop. The woman in the passenger seat wasn't Ruth Mitchell. "Ruth," Sarah called out. The woman turned around and Sarah found herself looking at Ashley Connor, her face now visible without the elaborate disguise she'd been wearing. "Hello, Sarah," Ashley said with a sweet smile. "Surprise, where's Ruth?" Ruth Mitchell had a sudden change of heart about the family plan. "She's currently securing your financial assets while we handle the medical situation." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. Ruth never agreed to this. Ruth wants what's best for David, but she's old-fashioned about methods. We're more progressive. Dr. Morrison was staring at her phone screen. This isn't what we agreed to, she whispered. Plans evolve, Ashley replied cheerfully. Sarah, you're about to give birth to David's child. After that, you're going to have a tragic accident. David will be devastated, of course, but he'll find comfort with me while raising your baby. A tragic accident. Psychiatric patients often harm themselves, especially after traumatic childbirth. Very sad, but not uncommon. Sarah felt another contraction building, but this time she welcomed the pain. It meant her baby was fighting to be born, fighting to survive whatever these people had planned. The Swiss facility was a lie. Completely. You're going to a private clinic where you'll deliver the baby under sedation. After that, Ashley shrugged. Well, let's just say the insurance money will set David and me up very nicely. Dr. Morrison stood up suddenly. I can't do this. This isn't medical treatment. This is murder. Dr. Morrison, Ashley's voice turned sharp. You've already taken our money and falsified medical records. You're in this completely. I agreed to help with involuntary psychiatric commitment, not murder. The difference is academic at this point. Sarah watched the exchange. Realizing that even Dr. Morrison hadn't understood the full scope of the plan, she'd been manipulated too, drawn in gradually until she was too compromised to back out. The van slowed down and turned into what looked like an abandoned medical complex. Sarah could see Nashville Women's Clinic closed signs on the building. This is insane, Dr. Morrison said. We can't perform medical procedures in an abandoned building. We can perform whatever procedures we want, Ashley replied. Sarah's going to disappear. The baby's going to survive. And everyone's going to believe she had a psychotic break and ran away. Sarah felt the strongest contraction yet, accompanied by a warm rush of fluid. Her water had broken. The baby's coming now, she gasped. Perfect, Ashley said, pulling out a syringe. This will help with the pain. But as Ashley approached with the syringe, Sarah heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of sirens, getting closer. Dr. Morrison's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her face went white. Ashley, she whispered, we have a problem. What kind of problem? My phone just received an automated message from Jake Sullivan. Ashley grabbed the phone and read the screen. Her confident expression crumbled. What does it say? Sarah asked. Dr. Morrison looked at her with something resembling hope. It says the FBI has been monitoring this operation for 6 weeks. They have video and audio recordings of everything. The van doors burst open. Federal agents surrounded the vehicle. Weapons drawn. FBI, nobody move. Sarah found herself looking at Agent Jennifer Walsh, a woman she'd never seen before but who spoke with absolute authority. Mrs. Mitchell, you're safe now. We've been tracking this conspiracy since Jake Sullivan first contacted us. Jake contacted the FBI 6 weeks ago. When he realized the scope of what David Mitchell was planning, he's been working undercover for us ever since. Sarah felt the world spinning. Jake is alive. Agent Walsh smiled. Very much alive, and very concerned about you and your baby. Going through the chaos of arrests and medical personnel arriving, Sarah heard Ashley screaming at Dr. Morrison. You said the FBI contacts were fake. You said it was just another one of Sarah's paranoid delusions. But Dr. Morrison was already cooperating with federal agents, apparently eager to minimize her own legal exposure. As paramedics helped Sarah into a real ambulance, Agent Walsh leaned close. Mrs. Mitchell, Jake Sullivan sends his regards. He said to tell you that sometimes the best way to catch a conspiracy is to let it think it's winning. Sarah closed her eyes as another contraction hit, this one bringing her baby closer to safety. David's perfect plan had indeed had one crucial flaw. He'd underestimated what people would do to protect an innocent life. And he'd never realized that Jake Sullivan was exactly the kind of investigator who contacted federal authorities when local corruption ran too deep to handle alone. 3 months later, Sarah sat in the federal courthouse holding her son Thomas, named after her father, while watching David Mitchell receive his sentence, 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and domestic terrorism. The defendant showed calculated cruelty in his systematic destruction of his wife's reputation and mental health. Judge Harrison stated, the conspiracy involved medical fraud, attempted murder, and the exploitation of institutional trust that strikes at the heart of our legal and medical systems. David sat at the defendant's table in orange jail clothing, his perfectly styled hair now unkempt, his confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose entire world had collapsed. He hadn't looked at Sarah once during the trial. Ashley Connor had already been sentenced to 15 years after accepting a plea bargain and testifying against David. Her testimony revealed the full scope of their plan, including details about how they'd researched psychiatric medications and practiced forging Sarah's signature for months. Dr. Morrison received 5 years for medical fraud and conspiracy. Though her cooperation with federal investigators had earned her a reduced sentence, she'd testified tearfully about how David had gradually drawn her into the conspiracy, starting with small ethical compromises and escalating to attempted murder. Maria Santos faced disbarment and 3 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy. Her betrayal still stung the most, though Sarah was beginning to understand how David had manipulated even her closest relationships. Ruth Mitchell had indeed been unaware of the murder plot, though she'd known about the affair and the financial manipulations. She'd lost most of her wealth in civil suits and now lived quietly in a retirement community, apparently genuinely remorseful about her role in enabling her son's crimes. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Harrison addressed Sarah directly, would you like to make a victim impact statement? Sarah stood, holding Thomas against her shoulder. He was healthy and perfect, with dark hair like David's, but eyes that reminded her of her own father. Your Honor, David Mitchell tried to convince everyone, including me, that I was losing my mind. He used the medical system, the legal system, and even my closest friendships as weapons against me. But what he never understood was that becoming a mother changes everything about how you see the world. She looked directly at David for the first time since the trial began. He finally met her eyes, and she saw nothing there she recognized. I don't forgive him, she continued. But I'm grateful this happened before Thomas was born, before my son could grow up thinking this kind of manipulation and cruelty was normal in relationships. After the sentencing, Sarah walked out of the courthouse into bright Nashville sunshine. Jake Sullivan waited by his car, looking exactly as she remembered him from college, just older and wearing a suit instead of jeans. How does it feel? He asked. Surreal, like I've been living in someone else's nightmare for months. Jake smiled. The FBI wants to use your case for training purposes. Apparently, domestic terrorism through medical and legal manipulation is becoming more common. Domestic terrorism, that's what they're calling it. Systematic use of institution to destroy someone's life and credibility. David wasn't just trying to kill you. He was trying to erase your entire existence first. Sarah adjusted Thomas in her arms, feeling his warm weight against her chest. What happens now? Now you rebuild. The insurance settlement should help, and David's assets are being liquidated to pay restitution. You'll be comfortable. I meant what happens with us. Jake studied her face. That's up to you. I'm not going anywhere. But I also don't want you to feel like you owe me anything because I helped catch the people who were trying to hurt you. Sarah looked at this man who'd risked his life to save hers and her babies, who'd worked undercover for weeks while everyone believed he was dead, who'd never asked for anything in return. I don't feel like I owe you anything, she said, but I'd like to find out who I am when I'm not being systematically destroyed by someone who's supposed to love me, and who you might be with someone who actually does love you. Maybe that too. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the living room of her new house, watching Jake help Thomas take his first wobbling steps across the hardwood floor. She'd started a consulting business helping other women document domestic abuse, working with federal investigators to identify the sophisticated manipulation tactics that traditional law enforcement often missed. The work was difficult but fulfilling. Sarah had discovered that her experience, horrific as it was, had given her unique insights into how abusers used institutional systems as weapons. She'd become an expert in recognizing the early warning signs of what the FBI now called systematic domestic terrorism. He's going to be walking everywhere soon, Jake observed as Thomas successfully made it from the couch to the coffee table. Good thing. I want him to grow up knowing he can trust his own feet to carry him wherever he needs to go. Jake looked at her with understanding. Trust was something Sarah was still rebuilding, not just in other people, but in her own judgment, her own perceptions, her own strength. But every day, holding her son and building a life based on honesty rather than manipulation, she felt more like the woman she'd been before David Mitchell tried to erase her. Thomas gurgled happily and took another unsteady step toward his future, in a house where the people who loved him would never use that love as a weapon against him. Some stories end with forgiveness and redemption. This one ended with justice and the fierce protection of innocence. Sometimes, that was more than enough. Sometimes it was everything. The end word count, 9, bird 87.